This is audio number 3 of week 1. Now we're on slide 16. So now we're looking at 2 other maps. Asia in 1900 and then after 1950. In 1900, this was the height of the colonial period in Asia, the Western colonial period in Asia. Now the United States is in the Philippines. The British presence is huge all over Southeast Asia. Look at India, Burma, they're in Malaya, Singapore. The Dutch have completely occupied Indonesia, modern-day Indonesia. The Japanese are in Korea. It's a mess, honey, let me tell you. In short, interactions between East and West in the early part of the 20th century were now out of control. It was one-sided, in other words. The Western powers, the colonial powers, and the Japanese were controlling everything, and there were numerous subject peoples all over the place. After 1950, a much different situation. Now, nationalist revolutions have recovered areas of Asia, and new nations are in place. And not too much has changed on that map since 2000. The map is basically the same. East Asia has become richer and more influential. However, political stability is now becoming a bit of a problem in many places. So when you're my age, in about 117, in about 40 years, East Asia will likely be the world's biggest opportunity or the world's biggest problem. Who knows? Going on to slide 17. So that's why you should be paying attention in this course. Yes, sir. So in review, to go back over the ground we just covered, 1800 approximates some very important developments. There were these mature regimes in Northeast Asia anyway, China, Japan, Korea, but there were problems, and we'll get into those problems in the next lecture. It wasn't just Western influence that changed everything. There were changes afoot in many of these places. But the entry of Western power became a game changer, became a catalyst that not only hurried along political developments, potential revolutions, but probably changed their direction. In China, for example, the leadership of the Qing dynasty was growing weaker and weaker. In Japan, they had been through an awful famine in the late 1700s and 1783 and into the rest of the 1780s, and which brought efforts at reform, which spawned resentment against the leadership of the so-called tent government, the Bakufu, the dominant warlords of the time. And we have this dawn of the industrial age in Europe and America. And what did that bring? That brought faster ships, that brought more powerful weaponry, that brought fire and maneuver, that far outclassed anything that was available in Asia. And so European powers, which were competing with each other, the French and the British, and the rising German power that was to come to fore after the Austro-Hungarian War. These powers were competing with each other, and indeed that competition extended to Asia and made more urgent their efforts to take land away from the people who were there. The pot was being stirred, in other words, between 1800 and 1850. Let's go on to slide 18. These terms, traditional and modern, are often disputed. When you get to graduate school, you can worry about that. You don't have to worry about it too much in this course. This is, after all, an introductory course. You'll learn about some of the arguments in the readings, in particular in the Emergence of Southeast Asia book, the great big book edited by Professor Owen. You'll learn about how these terms are disputed, but they're good for a start. As Westad, W-E-S-T-A-D, Westad, the man who wrote the book about China that we're using in this course, as he says in his book, the China-centric system was one where the emperor was the highest mortal human known to man. People who were outside of the Chinese cultural sphere were considered to be a lower tier, T-I-E-R, a lower tier of human, but still included amongst the emperor's subjects. China kept control of the empire's periphery, which included places like modern-day Vietnam and Burma, and Korea, even Japan. Not control where they had administrators on the ground, but control in making sure that these powers were not holding foreign relations with anybody else. And indeed, there really wasn't much else for foreign relations. Between Vietnam and China in this period, and here we're speaking about the early 1800s, this system had become a quasi-trade one. It was the so-called tribute system between China and the rest of its neighbors. But this was centered on maintaining China's control, and it was very different from the kind of country-to-country relations that we see in the modern world, and we will talk more about that later on. In a sense, there are a few parallels. I don't want to say that it's the same, but there are a few parallels to today's system where the United States gives endorsement to governments of certain nations, cooperation, assistance in exchange for political and economic cooperation from their end. This is a simplistic sort of comparison, but it's often ignored. Westerners were present, certainly, before 1800 as traders, as I mentioned, but they were itinerant. That is, they wandered in and wandered out. They didn't stay. They certainly did not try to challenge local power before 1800, but once the Industrial Revolution started going, this gave Western powers the power to challenge local authority and, in essence, to take over. After 1800, one of the cusps of change was that European visitors to Asia began to become a military threat, an actual threat to the power of local regimes. Their dynamic at work was this Industrial Revolution. A major wrinkle to this story, in the readings you'll see that the Dutch were not really occupying, but just residing, like the Portuguese were in Macau. They were residing in ports amongst different kingdoms, unconnected to each other, in modern-day Indonesia. The British actually forced the Dutch to become real Industrial Revolution colonists. They forced the Dutch to take over Indonesia. Why did they do that? Because the British wanted to keep out the French. It was a sort of a use it or lose it scenario. The British-French rivalry was another important dynamic at work in the early part of the 19th century, all the way until about 1870. The two sides agreed to keep Thailand. This is something that isn't discussed very much in courses like this. Thailand and Japan had some interesting parallels. that they went through in dealing with the West. The British and the French decided to keep Thailand more or less neutral and to set up Thailand as a buffer zone between their empires. The British were next door in Burma to the west. The British were in Malaya to the south. The French were in Indochina to the east of Thailand. The British and the French wished to avoid accidental war between the two of them that would be unnecessary and would threaten the economic development they were trying to pursue in these new colonies of theirs. Now this all changed, not all in one year, but in the decades after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71, that's what I meant to say before, not Austro-Hungarian, sorry. After the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71, when the British and French became a lot more concerned about the rise of Germany than they were about the rise of each other, their interests slowly began to converge. And over the decades, they became de facto allies, which of course was a major development that accompanied World War I. Germany against the British and the French. Their positions in Asia, that is, the British and French, stabilized with this new shared interest in resisting German power. Let's go on to slide 19. So, East Asia, it says here, the greater changes between 1800 and 2000. There were things that were going on in both places, in Europe and America and in Asia. The advent of mechanization and increasingly sophisticated technology. There was a shift from agriculture to manufacturing in these societies. Much slower in Asia, but it was still happening. And we're talking all the way to 2000, of course. There have been expanded personal freedoms in both civilizations, and increased sexual equality. But on the right, you can see these other things were going on. The scale of transfer and acceptance of ideas from west to east in the early part of the 20th century was striking. And when I talk about that, I'm talking about Christianity, socialism, market capitalism. These ideas from the West were being adopted one after the other by different groups of people all over Asia. Sometimes the adoption did not last very long, other times it did. There have been exceptions, of course. For example, Buddhism has traveled from east to west. It has a fairly strong foothold in the West now, but the parallel developments of worldwide transfer of ideas from east to west are small in comparison to the adoption of ideas from the West in Asia. To restate this, I've been a little bit clumsy at this. The transfer of ideas from the West to Asia was much greater than the transfer of ideas from Asia to the West. This imbalance is partly due to the massive failure of Eastern ideologies and institutions under the assault of Western military power in the 19th century. There was a complete failure in the eyes of ordinary people, of institutions in Asia to provide basic security in the face of this Western assault, and nothing dissatisfies the voters. even if they're not voters, more than a complete loss of security. As these European incursions escalated, there were efforts, of course, to resist. Many of these efforts carried revolutionary elements that were to become nationalist over time, faster in some places than in others. Among them, there was the so-called internationalist efforts of the Communist International, or Comintern. That is the Comintern, which were especially prominent in China and Indochina, but they were also present in Singapore, Malaya, India, and present-day Indonesia. These turned out to be run completely from Moscow. Another revolutionary change was the accelerating pace of economic growth that especially picked up in the second half of the 20th century, that is the 1900s. It was by no means steady or linear. It was one step forward, one step to the side, one step backwards, two steps forward, and so on. We'll also discuss economic growth as a major theme toward the end of the course. Now let's go on to slide 20. So I don't want to belabor this too many times. This is all in your syllabus. And by the way, please read your syllabus. Read your syllabus. Don't tell me you didn't see the things I put in there. I want you to understand the historical foundations of modern East Asian societies. Appreciate the diversity of peoples and all that. You can read this. I shouldn't be reading it to you. We've already touched on these goals, really. Here I'd like to emphasize that you keep on top of these goals as you do the readings because, hint, hint, these goals will provide you with some guide to the sort of things you're going to have to do in the course, the papers you're writing, and the final exam. They are especially hints about the final exam. So keep on top of these things. Keep these things in mind as you listen to the lectures, do the videos, do the readings, because these great changes over the past 200 years in East Asia, both Northeast Asia, that is China, Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia, the vast area from Burma to Indonesia, are not without contradiction. For example, in spite of the broad adoption of Western ideas in late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the eventual anti-foreign backlash that followed, and the overthrow of colonialism at mid-20th century, the economic and political relations with prominent Western nations have remained steadily important to everybody in Asia. If you think about it, that's quite a contradiction. We threw them out, but we still need them. After World War II, in particular, this economic power of the West, especially the United States, and the continuing need to have good relations with the major economic powers of the world has meant that Asia has to keep in touch with its former colonial masters. The role of Australia I touch upon a little bit in this course. I can't get into too much of it because there just isn't time. But I want you to be able to understand that that role has changed quite a bit over the last 200 years. Australia started off being a prison colony to replace America. After 1783, you may not realize this, but the British used to ship its prisoners, its criminals that wanted to get rid of, to America. After 1783, they couldn't do that anymore, so they started to ship them to Australia, which they had recently discovered as a potential destination. Eventually, Australia became an outpost of British power, and eventually it became America's main ally in Asia. Indeed, there's an argument made by some that Australia is actually a closer ally than any other country, including Britain and Canada. But But this relationship is an interesting one, and there's a lot of implication for modern Asian history in this relationship. This growth of Australian involvement in Asia after World War II is of special significance, which we'll talk about later. And indeed, this American advantage in being able to project power all over the place is partly due to this very close relationship it has with 4 other nations, that is, with the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. This is the so-called Five Eyes relationship between these countries. It's, without a doubt, the world's closest and most intimate military and intelligence alliance, as you've probably been reading about lately. Going on to the last slide, slide 21. There are 2 other goals here. I want to help you get a job, and I want to help you be a better informed voter. That's what these 2 basically mean. Make sure you please make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel. There'll be a link in you've already used this link to get to this video, so please subscribe to my YouTube channel. That way, as soon as I post these things, you know that they're there. And I hope that we can work together and make sure that you come out of this course with better writing skills, with a better understanding of modern history, and indeed that you have some skills that will make you more employable. I'm always happy to consult with you about that sort of thing too. So please take these next steps, and we will talk again soon. Thank you very much.